Hi, and welcome to another episode of Dev to Dev, the podcast about everyday video game developers and why they do what they do every day. This is another episode with someone I'd never met, and another opportunity to get to know someone, Leyla Lacombe, who has a wonderful, fascinating history from growing up in France and to America and Brussels and back to America, to not realizing that video games were made by people, but being a big fan of them, growing up with her dad and learning to love video games through her family. And then finding her way in through esports, a role that maybe wasn't perhaps what she dreamed of doing, but was a great opportunity to learn. And then a journey through Ubisoft and onto Sony Santa Monica. Really fascinating journey, really interesting perspective, some great little phrases and one-liners that I really like. Just a really interesting lens to see the industry through. Somebody who's found their calling by being brave and looking around to try and find the role that suits her best. So it's another great conversation, exactly what this podcast is all about. I really appreciate Leyla taking the time. As always, this podcast, the audio version is available for free in Season 2. All of Season 1 is available on the Patreon for Dev to Dev, as well as the video versions of all of the Season 2 episodes as they're released. Please support the show if you can. It would really help me just to take care of the hosting costs and the various charges that are required to create and edit this show, which I love to do. I wish it was free, but it's not quite. Please support the show if you can. Please share and like. But in the meantime, sit back and listen in to episode 4 of Dev to Dev Season 2 with Leyla Lacombe. Well, thank you again for making the time. I appreciate it. I'm excited to dig into your history and get to know you a little bit. We've never met before. We kind of connected.
First time.
Yes, connected through the podcast, and I appreciate you reaching out and agreeing to jump on and have a conversation.
Well, I appreciate you giving these opportunities because, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, but my education is in theater and acting, and so I'm always looking for opportunities to do that in video games. So
fantastic. Yes, you have a fascinating career, one that I'm excited to learn more about. But I always like to kick it off with my favorite first question. What first inspired you about video games?
Ooh, okay. This is a great question. I'm going to answer this in two parts. My professional inspiration in video games actually came very late. But what inspired me to kind of think about video games as a whole is a lot of the time it was just connecting with my father. He was, one of the original gamers. He's always been so far ahead of the curve in technology. He's an early adopter to everything. I think we could have an Apple History Museum hosted at our house because my dad has the original Macintosh. He has every iPod that's ever been. Him and my mom are very they believe technology can do a lot of good. Nowadays, not so sure about that. But back then, it was an easier belief.
The halcyon days.
Yes. And so I can't even quite remember my first memory of video games, but I seem to have these, maybe retold to me memories of my dad, watching me and playing a driving simulator on his computer with me in his arms, and so pretty early on, the first video game I really remember playing with him is actually SSX Tricky on the PS2, I think.
Yep.
And that just kind of started this realm of a whole other side of entertainment and fun and joy that can come. We then, 4 years later, my parents had a little boy, so I had a little brother, and that was obviously, we roped him into the family. Gaming, one of my favorite memories is New Year's Eve 2004, maybe. My dad and I finally beat The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. We stayed up all night, and that morning at 1 a.m. on New Year's Day, we beat the final boss, and it was amazing. So really the inspiration of gaming, I feel was kind of handed down to me generationally almost. But in terms of my professional life, I, like I said, went to school for acting. I actually double majored in media studies. I like to say I double majored in unemployment. And I was, going to try and pursue acting. I had media studies as a backup so that, if I needed to get a job as an advertising agency or something like that, I could stay in the realm of entertainment. But I went to school at UC Berkeley in California, and some really incredible people surrounding you all the time, just so inspirational. And this group of friends came up to me and was like, hey, we want to try and start a club for women in the games industry. And we know that you're a big gamer. I used to do other work for like women's empowerment at school. And so they were like, do you want to join? And so I joined in this club and I started as their industry relations chair. And my role was to get people mentorship opportunities in the games industry, sort of in the San Francisco area. And as I was going through all of that, I was like, well, I've always loved video games as a hobbyist. I've never really thought about the people who make them as a job. They kind of happened in a vacuum to me. And so being in that club, one, made me realize like how many roles there are in video games. And also I was like, well, if I'm gathering all these cool opportunities for other people, should I try gathering some for myself? And so I started making these connections and reaching out to people. And that kicked me off into originally sort of esports sponsorships and project management for like in-kind exchanges. And then I eventually moved into actual game development production, which I have now been doing for like 6 or 7 years.
Cool. That is already a great it's a unique intro. That's one I've not had yet. I love it. I want to take just a couple of steps back. So video games are obviously a big family tradition, right? So it's been part of your family life, it sounds like, since you were a kid. Where did you grow up?
I'm gonna really answer all of your questions with such long answers. I apologize. I originally grew up I was born in France, right outside of Paris, a little town named Suresnes. And I only lived there until I was about 2.5 years old before my parents moved to Reading, Philadelphia, which every time I've moved, my dad has gotten a job and we've just kind of followed him out there. So I lived in Pennsylvania from the ages of like 2.5 to 5, which is why I sound American, despite the fact that I'm originally French. Moved back to France at that point, so 5 years old. And I lived right outside of like Versailles area. So I went to international school there and I continued to speak English and French until I moved to Belgium when I was 12. And then I finished out my education 12 to 18 in Belgium, in Brussels, and then I moved to California for school, and I've been in the US for 11 years now. I stayed in the Bay Area for quite some time, and more recently I've now moved to Los Angeles.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So how important to you, moving can be quite disruptive, right? I've done it, my kids have moved countries. I know that's, quite a big step. Like, how important was gaming to you during those phases?
I think it's so important to be able to get back into your routine quickly when you're sort of a younger child and moving around. And it's like, yes, you both have that flexibility to be like, well, how different is this place from the next one? But also it is very like, I don't know any of the corner stores anymore. I don't know any of the people at my school. And so knowing that I had things like video games, honestly, My Little Pony was huge for me to connect with other people. It was just very nice to have that sort of constant. I've been a PlayStation and a Nintendo console person. So, having like the DS or the 3DS, having it be portable, being something I can share with people at school is like a very big step in like making new friends when everyone already has their friend group. So I think that was really great. And then just also it being like, the escape that people sometimes find. Like I could boot up my Animal Crossing village and it's the exact same as when I was in France, even though I'm now in Belgium. That's always comforting.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it sort of grounds you, even though everything around you is different. You're sort of grounded in something familiar. That's so cool. And I'm guessing that, was kind of multiplayer a part of that as well? Being able to kind of, be introduced to different people through playing games together. Was that also relevant?
Yeah, I didn't do a whole lot of introducing people who weren't familiar with games to the world of gaming, but I feel pretty lucky that I had a lot of friends, both men, or I guess boys and girls, who were actually into video games. I didn't face a lot of the stigma growing up that I know a lot of women face in the industry and just in the hobby in general. But I'm a big fan of a couch co-op. I love a party game. Like inviting my friends over to play Mario Kart or Mario Party was always such an easy win. I'm remembering a memory I have not accessed in so long. Wow. I used to live close enough to school and we had the ability to have essentially like home lunch. If your parents came and signed you out, signed you back in. And so my mom and a couple of the other moms at the school essentially started a rotating like lunch. So like each mom would host a group of 3 or 4 kids. And when everyone came to my house, we would go downstairs to the basement. We would play Mario Kart. And so all the other people were like, oh, I can't wait to go back to Layla's house. And that was the only time I felt so popular at school, was because my mom was okay with us playing one game of Mario Kart over lunch.
And that was enough to connect you and make you the cool kid. That's great. And like you said, so you studied a lot of kind of theatre and media studies early on. So it sounds like video games were just a hobby, not a profession for quite a while. Like you said, it took a while for you to really connect with that as a profession. In that sort of time between playing games and being a hobby and you realizing that you could do it, where did you think games came from? Like, how did you think? I only asked that because I had exactly the same thing where I was like, games come from space, basically.
Yeah, that's why I laugh, because the genuine answer to that is I didn't think about it. It's good to teach your kids where things come from and the value of things. Like, I knew toys were made by people in some way, right? But video games to me were just such a, like, it felt almost so foreign. It's like when people try to explain to me how a printer works, and I'm like, you're never going to explain that to me. I don't understand the science behind it. If you break down the science, it's just not going to get in here, because that's not what my brain is meant to process. And that felt like video games for a long time, because it was like, how do you explain the coolest thing you've ever seen? Like, you're telling me I not only get to like watch a cool animated movie, which I'm a big fan of animation. I'm always fighting the fight that animation is not a genre, it's a medium, and you have every genre exists in animation. I actually wanted to be an animation producer before I realized that video games was an option. And so not only do I get to watch my favorite thing ever, animated images on screen, but I actually get to make it be a part of the story. My decisions matter. Even in games where your decisions don't matter, your decisions matter, because if you don't jump, the character's not jumping. And it's kind of like almost like the Pandora's box of, it's like, I'm not going to ask any questions about it. It's beautiful and I get to enjoy it, and I don't need to dive deeper into that.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I for a long time I had the same feeling. You almost don't want to know, because they're so special. Like, I love enjoying them. Okay, yes, and so a very, like you said, theatre, and so you came to UC Berkeley. You were involved in gaming there, like you said.
Just like until my senior year, when we founded that Women in Gaming Club, I was just like, UC Berkeley has this really great thing called Democratic Education at Cal, or DECALs, which is, as long as a student gets sign off from a professor for the subject that they'd like to teach, you can teach a class on it. And so famously, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, there was a bunch of comments about UC Berkeley having a Kanye decal and a Drake decal about like the history of their music and so on. But while I was there, there was also something like the Pokemon decal, which I took, and I have my Pokemon badge to prove that I finished the class. And that was both an exploration of like Pokemon as a franchise and the evolution of the games, the cross-media storytelling that they do, where the shows tie into the games, tie into the movies, tie into the trading cards. But it was also like a very academic, like, what is the biology behind Pokemon? And so for my final project on that class, we had to pick an evolutionary line and essentially like diagram out their biological possibility. And so we picked the Shinx line. One of my friends did the skeletal structure that would be needed to support a Shinx in real life. I did something about the like biological the specific kinds of organs they would need to have, for example, to generate electricity. And we thought that it might be like static electricity that is built up in their fur and then directed to a specific area that they can then discharge. And so all that to say, I've always had this approach of video games that is like, yes, it's something I play, but it's also something I like to live in my life. And so that professional aspect was kind of that missing third pillar that I just didn't know was there. And so when I did kind of come to that very late realization of like, yeah, these exist because someone or a group of people made them, it became very like instead of the fear of like, oh, if I know how the sausage gets made, I'm not going to be interested in it anymore. It became very like, oh, this is what I've been missing. And like a lot of the questions or the things that I've kind of been ignoring because I didn't think I'd ever find an answer. Like now that I have the possibility of maybe answering those, I'm like even more motivated to go through them.
Huh. Interesting. So it sort of added a whole new way of understanding video games that you didn't realize you were missing, but once you found it, you were like, oh, this is the thing.
Yeah, I think there's, as a media studies major, I spent a lot of time breaking down media way past what the average person is doing. And obviously there's some fun in that, nothing has no meaning, right? The everything, even a choice an author thinks they didn't make, they made by not making it, right? And so I think a lot of the times I felt a big disconnect in my experiences and love of theater and acting because a lot of my other filmmaking friends would like watch movies every day in their spare time or like review monologues. And I just wasn't finding myself drawn to that like I was drawn to playing Breath of the Wild or booting up the next Pokemon game. And for a long time, I was like, oh, I just don't have the discipline or the, self-study that I need. And then my now husband, who I met in our filmmaking club, actually was like, have you considered that maybe what we're doing with films, you're actually doing with video games, and you're just trying to misalign two things that you think you want to continue your interest in theater, but really, like, what if you just explore the video games further? And that was a big revelation to me. And again, like, oh yeah, people make video games, and I could not even be a part of that at that point, but like I could start learning about that. I could get into media analysis of video games. Like, how many franchises are there that span decades that you can have direct comparisons to? And so, yeah, that really unlocked a big part of like the conversation I didn't know I had been missing about video games.
Huh. And is that around the same time that the sort of Cow Women in Gaming?
Yeah, all of that happened within like 2-3 years of each other, essentially.
Got it. Okay. Then really sort of expanded your mind into game development, game production, that kind of stuff. Okay, cool. And so you mentioned esports, right? So you find your way into video games through the esports angle. Like, tell me about that. Like, were you a big esports fan at the time? Like, how did that connection start, and how did it feel to kind of be in the industry, but an unusual entrance vector of kind of the esports era?
Yeah, esports was not something I knew anything about really until maybe 2 years before I actually broke into the industry. And the only reason I knew about them is because I happened to really like playing Overwatch, and San Francisco had an Overwatch League team called the San Francisco Shock, and UC Berkeley was our collegiate partner for them. And so literally I like volunteered to be a brand ambassador for the San Francisco Shock, and I actually ended up meeting some of the team, and in that way I started following the teams, and so I started getting into esports. But like a lot of other things that I do, I can have a huge amount of attachment to things that I consider are like hometown or local, even if I don't follow as a whole. So like I never followed the Overwatch League. I just watched the San Francisco Shock matches, and I never really branched out into other esports because it was a lot of games I had never played. And so coming into the esports of, at the time I was working at Ubisoft, our big esports title was Rainbow Six Siege, and then we had some smaller esports titles. And I was like, well, my brother loves Rainbow Six, so I've watched Rainbow Six through my brother, and obviously I want to do a good job at my job, so I'm gonna do research. I'm gonna watch the Rainbow Six League, and I ended up falling in love with it because who doesn't like watching people who are really, really good at what they do, and you get that adrenaline rush of like, are we gonna win? Are we gonna lose? Right? Like, I think live sports and live esports and even streamed, that's what's most interesting to me about it, is like the journey we go on every time. So I got really into the Rainbow Six League, but like now that I don't work there anymore, there's other things also that like the league has been going down, but like I never followed it after I stopped working for it. And it's not that I only cared about it as a professional thing, but it's just I felt like I had spent my time with it, and I was like, I'll cherish those memories forever. But again, like that's not how I wanted to spend my free time. And that's kind of how I knew that while esports was really cool, and I know a lot of people love esports, and I was so thankful for how it got me into the industry, it was also something that I knew was like not in my 5-year plan. Because if I'm feeling this somewhat surface level attachment to it, and there's 15 people behind me who have the same skill set as me but love it, why would I stay in this place? I would love to give that up for someone who's going to be even more invested. And at the same time, I wanted to find what that big attachment was for me. And I'm very thankful for esports for showing me one of the many no's that it was going to be. And obviously you're looking for the yes, but like, how can you find it without going through a lot of other things and really giving it a try? Like, I wouldn't have given up on esports 2-3 months in. I spent a little more than a year in that sphere before I was like, I think this is not the long term for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way of looking at it. It was, like you say, it gave you a good opportunity to break into the industry, in some form, but turned out not to be, your number one passion. So when you realized that, and as you mentioned, you kind of shifted over to Ubisoft. How did that transition happen, and how did it feel?
Thankfully, I was working on the Ubisoft publishing side, so the literal transition ended up being a very quick, like, bureaucratic figure out. So when I shifted over, thankfully, I was going from Ubisoft publishing to Ubisoft development, essentially. So that actually just ended up being like a bureaucratic thing that they took care of. But in terms of like how my mentality shifted or everything that led up to the actual transfer of title, it was a lot of that question of, okay, I know this isn't what I like long term, but what did I like about it? What kept me here for a year? And how can I chase more of that? And so one of the things I really recognized in myself was that I really liked a lot of the project management aspect of it. So like working on getting deliverables, working on making sure that timelines are hit early so that we don't have knock-on effects for things. That was all very interesting to me. And I had some really great bosses and coworkers at that studio where I could essentially go up to them and be like, hey, I'd love to know more about XYZ. Do you know someone at this company who can tell me about that? And my bosses were really well connected. They had been at Ubisoft for like 15 years. So they literally like handed me on a platter all of these experts that I could talk to. And I talked to a huge amount of different teams. I talked to some PR representatives. I talked to our actual brand managers on the Ubisoft side. And then they ended up also connecting me to a video game producer. And so we had like a coffee chat, and I was essentially asking her a lot of questions of like, here's my understanding of production from theater, from film. Can you like help me figure out where those differences and similarities overlap in video game? And that conversation led to me realizing I felt like I had a lot of those skills. I feel like the overlap is actually pretty significant. I know people think sometimes video games and film are like two completely different industries, but I think especially because my interest was in animated movies, like what is an animated movie but a long cutscene, So I found a huge amount of overlap there, and then it became both an effort in genuine curiosity and persistence. I kept in touch with that sort of producer every month. We would meet for coffee, and I would not be in this position at all if this specific producer, Kim, or anyone who's ever extended a time to anyone, the 10, 15, 30 minutes that they take out of your day goes so far for the people that you're helping. And so I'm infinitely thankful to her. But we met every month, and I kept asking more and more specific questions, and she would sort of challenge me to look into like, well, let's talk about actual production methodologies. Like, go learn what waterfall is, go learn what agile means, and come back to me with those questions. And then when I came with those questions, she would give me scenarios for the previous game that they had just shipped that answered those questions. So I had these real world examples that I was building. And by the end of like a long year of chatting and just no expectations, she was like, do you want to come meet our executive producers? And I went out to lunch with them, and we chatted about a bunch of stuff. And maybe 2-3 weeks later, they came to me with an offer of a contract role to come be an associate producer at the studio. And I was elated and so excited. And I also was devastated because I felt like I was going to have to turn this contract role down because I was currently employed full time by Ubisoft, and the COVID pandemic had just hit. They offered me this in June or July of 2020, and really I couldn't get past the idea that I was going from full-time employment with health insurance to an unknown amount of contract time. And I agonized over this decision because, this is exactly what I had been working a year on. Like, I was going to get to be an associate producer. I was going to work with all these people. And I had spent a lot of my early career being, I think, a little naive, like many people are. And I hadn't felt the downsides of it because I happened to be surrounded by some really exceptional people. Like, my first boss negotiated my contract for me when I went from an intern to full-time at Ubisoft. And that's definitely something I should have done, you know? So I learned a lot of lessons from that, and that, like, okay, I need to sit up to that. And so when this came up and I was like, I really want to take this role, but is it the smart thing to do? I agonized over it for so many days, and I ended up having to write down how I was going to turn down this role because I was worried I would get emotional over it. And I spoke to this producer who I'd been speaking to for a year, and I called her and I was like, I'm going to have to say no to this role, and I really appreciate everything, but I wish life was just about what I want to do, but we live in a more complicated society than that. And even though I wrote everything down, I still ended up crying. And to her credit, she was like, I actually was thinking of messaging you that I don't think you should take this. I think that this is too big of a change. And so I do really appreciate her honesty there too. And 2 months later, I got a call from them, and they were like, they were able to pull some strings, and I'll technically be on contract at the studio, but I will retain my full-time employment status with Ubisoft Publishing. And that felt like it had taken away the risk. Enough of the risk. There's obviously always risk, but it felt like, okay, this is a stretch I'm willing to do. And then I spent 5 years being a producer over there. So it all thankfully worked out.
Man, that's such a cool story. So you went from intern to full-time to offered a role that you really wanted but couldn't take, to getting the role that you wanted with the security, more of the security that you needed. And all of that is in the context of you trying to figure out what the right role is within the industry, full stop, right? Because you'd had this esports thing that was maybe not quite your jam. And landed at a company that had that amount of range of options, right? Ubisoft is such a huge company, and you were searching for that opportunity. That's such a bold move to do, right? So many people just get a role and they're like, I'm just so grateful I've got this role. I'm not even going to think about what else I could do, right? That's so cool that you took that step and it worked out.
Yeah, I think my dad has always told me something that I try to share back with people, which is the easiest time to find another job is when you have a job, right? And so, which is not to say like as soon as you get a job, look for your next one, but it is to say like, when do you have the luxury of being able to have those conversations with yourself and explore the world, even if it's just informally? And so, you know, with what you said, like Ubisoft has every department you could ever imagine across every continent. Why wouldn't I reach out to those people and ask? And obviously you have to be realistic with your expectations, right? Like, I'm not, spend a day with me and tell me everything you do. But I'm at work every day. We all have a lunch break. I could take a 30-minute coffee break. Like, let's see who I can learn from. And I think selfishly, a lot of people have, you have something to learn from everybody that you speak to, right? So I was also like, I have an interesting perspective as someone who's newer to the industry, has been a long time hobbyist, you know, like maybe I can share some things with you too. So yeah, it's very, and thankfully producing ended up resonating with me pretty quickly. But to this day, I just had a meeting with the community manager at my new studio where I was like, tell me, what's your 30-minute pitch on what's going on here? And actually that's a connection from the UC Berkeley Women in Gaming. So what a full circle moment. Such
a small world. So I want to just take a second to think about, so you find this role, you find this company like the Ubisoft that has this many opportunities. When you that was your proper into the industry, right? The esports was a taste, right? It was a specific angle, but getting into Ubisoft, right? That's really you. And it sounds like you grabbed that opportunity with both hands. Is that what you do, Leyla? Is that you as a person, or were you in that scenario, buoyed by this opportunity? Like, does that define who you are, or is that something that were you sort of out of your skin when you did that thing? Was it just something that you look back on and go, who was that person? How did they do that?
That's a great question. I think it's certainly who I would like to be, and I think I've made some big strides in heading that way. I mean, I think, like I mentioned, there's no way that I would have gotten this exact into producing if everything hadn't aligned, if my bosses hadn't been great to begin with and had taught me a lot of the lessons I needed to learn, if these people weren't available. But I do think that I would have found my way into producing if it's, as long as I had figured out that that's what I wanted to do. I think I have so many little like sentences or phrases that I have to keep reminding myself of, because that's the best way for me to sort of internalize things. And so, you know, closed mouths don't get fed. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Like, I have found that when you get over the fear of a no, a lot of things feel a lot easier. And it's not easy every day. I have to remind myself sometimes that, like, as long as I'm polite and respectful, the worst thing that can happen is a no or no answer. And that's something you have to remind yourself every day, right? Like, you ebb and flow through learning those lessons. But I do really think that I encourage myself, and I try to encourage other people to, like, see what happens. I could have said I'm not going to take this esports role at all, because I had never watched esports prior to that. And that, I think, could have been very reasonable to be like, it's not something I feel I have enough knowledge in. And instead I was like, okay, what if I take the time to, like, really kind of dive into what this is? And I have a little bit of a passing interest I've heard before, and let's explore. And even though that ultimately ended up being a no to me on esports, like, how much did I learn and grow through all of that, even if it's to arrive at the same conclusion versus saying no from the beginning, you know? So yeah, I really think I strive to be that person of, like, yes, I have this one door open, but, like, let's try these other doors and see if maybe some of them are unlocked. And then we don't have to walk into any of them right now, but it's nice to know they're there.
That makes a lot of sense. And this might be a stretch, but I've heard this in other stories of people who have traveled around a lot, right? Moved around a lot as kids. Is it possible maybe that you felt like you had less to lose than other people, right? That you especially with your kind of theatre background, right? Like, was there an element that maybe you as a person were sort of set up to be bold and brave in that way? As opposed to someone, I think about this as my own kids, right? Like, who have moved country. I emigrated into a different country. You moved countries, right? It toughens you in a way, right? And you talked about, right, having to find friends and, like, find your grounding even when you're in a place you don't know. Like, I'm wondering if that sort of steeled you in a way that would make you brave. Again, that might be a reach, but I wonder if that kind of made you braver to try those things.
I think at the very least it makes you more comfortable with the unknown, because you spend so much time being like, well, for the next 2 weeks, I'm not going to know what it's like to live here because this is my first day. And surely you go back to your routines or you find your comfort again. But for those 2 weeks, you're like, listen, I know this uncomfortability has an end date. And so maybe I can just live in it a little bit. I think the theater thing probably does help. And I think a lot of times people ask me, like, well, how do actors stop having stage fright? And I was like, I don't know that many actors who have no stage fright. We just don't let that be more of an impact on us than anything else, right? Like, every time I go on stage, my stomach hurts and I'm really stressed out. And then I go, you've spent months rehearsing this and all you can do is try. And then you go out there anyways, right? And the nerves dissipate, and you have good nights and you have bad nights, and it doesn't matter. The next day, everything feels nervous again. But it is really just getting comfortable with that. I think there's, like, a phrase people have to say, which is, like, do it scared. Because at least you're doing it. And if you wait your whole life to not be scared of it anymore, then you can't do it. And again, everything I'm saying, easy to preach, difficult to do in your life. But remembering all of these little things is like, yeah, like, what's the worst that can happen? I fall completely flat on my face in front of this group of people that I probably will never see again in my life. Embarrassing. Tomorrow morning, the sun is still rising,
Yeah. And I love that framing of kind of being comfortable with the unknown. That resonates with me a lot. And I think that is a good, especially in this industry, I think that is a good comfort to have, because a lot of what we do is unknown. Right? Every game we make is unknown until it's finished. And even then it's often still a bit unknown. So yeah, I like that framing a lot. So production then. So you found a home in production. What was it? What is it about production that really resonates with you?
I think there's a lot of things. The easy one to call out is I'm a very type A person. I plan my vacations with Excel schedule, and I've talked to my husband about this a lot actually, which is like I like to be able to plan just enough so that then we can wing it on the day, but like I know what trains we're going to take to get to our destination, and I know the hotel and where the hotel is, and that it's a good area for a lot of food, and then we can decide the food day of. I don't need to get that granular, but I like to know my options. So I think just by virtue of that, like, what is production but spreadsheets and schedules and things. But I think more importantly and more personally, a lot of what interests me about general project management and producing is that I see these all as skills I have, organization, communication, so on. And I find it very meaningful to contribute those things I'm good at for a process or a project that I really am excited about the end product for. And so obviously we talk about working in games. Is it really nice to be able to point to a bush in a game and be like, I made that bush? Yes. And I cannot do that currently at this state of my career and my interests and my skills and the things I feel I'm good at. But I can also look at a game that's come out and be like, if I hadn't been there, and I use I as my role and not me specifically, but like if the producer for this role hadn't been there, who knows if this game would be out? Who knows what the quality would be like? Who knows what would have made or not made it? And I think it's being a part of that big sort of unknown middle step of like start a game idea, do a lot of stuff, and then a game is made. That just feels very exciting, and it just, you like to do the things you're good at, and being able to do those in contribution to a bigger goal is really amazing. And then the third thing is kind of like you mentioned in terms of theater and so on. I'm a big fan of people, psychology, learning how people interact, relationship building. And a lot of producing can be that. I mean, there's the task of get this done on time, and then there's the actual implementation of how do you get a group of people who all have different priorities, different skill sets, different timelines to come together and make this. And that challenge is the most interesting part for me. Anything that's hard to describe about producing is like the stuff I live for. And, we say in production, if you could predict what the job would be, they wouldn't need us. Right? Because the whole point of having people whose entire responsibility is just to prepare for the unexpected is that, yeah, they have the brain capacity to expend to be like, nothing is going as planned. How do we wrap around that? And if the people who have to go through their tasks also needed to do that, there would be no brain capacity to do the work. So I think it's just very exciting to be like, wow, a huge fire has come up. Everybody stay away. I've got this. And then to know that like the actual solution is going to involve all those people coming back in. But for a little bit, it's like, I got this.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think you're absolutely right. There's a huge part of production that is psychology. I think as a designer, I think there's a huge part of design that's psychology as well. And I think a good producer that's aware of that and empathetic and, can manage people, can be a lighthouse in the storm often. So you sort of rose through the producer ranks at Ubisoft and really found your home in production. And then you changed, you move over to Sony Santa Monica. So how did that change happen, and how did it feel to kind of, you sort of found your career, if you like, at one place, and then you moved somewhere else? How was that?
Yeah, I mean, like many people, this change came from a layoff for me. So there was a time, maybe 3-4 months before it actually happened, that I was having conversations with my husband of like, if I stayed my whole career at Ubisoft, would that be acceptable to me? Would I feel fulfilled? And I knew even if I came to a conclusion now, I would certainly allow myself to have that conversation again, because there's no way I can decide 7 years into my career. But it was good to know that I was considering that and interested enough to like have that conversation. And so when the layoffs happened and they actually shut the whole Ubisoft San Francisco studio down, it was very shocking, but it was also, what's the state of the industry right now? And it was also like, okay, well, the question I was asking myself doesn't really apply anymore, right? There's, at least right this second, not a chance of me to stay my whole career at Ubisoft, which is not to say I won't ever go back or anything like that. But that was a big sort of question I had been wrestling with that all of a sudden didn't matter. And so it was like, what do I pivot all of this like thinking energy to? And so a lot of it was a consideration of where I now lived. I had moved to Los Angeles while being remote at Ubisoft San Francisco because my husband works in film. And so he was working down here at the studios. And it was like, well, there's obviously still a lot of remote jobs, but I really appreciate the privilege of still living kind of close to my office and being able to come in and meet people and so on. So I was like looking in geographical locations, and I was also thinking about the things at Ubisoft that I maybe was okay doing because the overall product or job that I had was great, but like if I could have changed them, would I? And one of those was the kind of genre that I was working on. At Ubisoft San Francisco, we were working on X Defiant, which was a first-person arcade shooter, right? And I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of Overwatch, but I've never really played the Call of Duty or anything like that. And so the more realistic kind of middle ground was never my cup of tea, which I think is just as interesting for career development, right? Like, yeah, don't only produce the things you know. But after spending 7 years there, I was like, well, it would be kind of cool to produce a game that I'm really excited about. And so my big genres of game are really narrative. I have a preference in leaning towards Nintendo, but unfortunately I don't speak Japanese yet, so that'll be a future career goal perhaps. But, knowing that some of the big Sony studios are in Los Angeles is like, well, what are the big narrative games of the last, 10, 15 years? My husband is not a big gamer. He grew up in film and TV and so on. And so when we started dating, he was like, well, I'd love to know a little bit more about video games, but it was so hard to find for someone who has no sense of their taste in games. It's like, where do you start people? And so he was like, what is the game of the decade that you would start me off? And knowing that he would want a single player game, he would want more of a narrative one. I was like, I kind of feel like your two options are God of War or Last of Us. And he ended up picking The Last of Us. And so we went through that. But that I think calls out the fact that I've always been very in awe of these large, complex narratives that Sony and many other studios put out. And so it just so happened that Sony Santa Monica had an environment art producer, which is what I started doing at Ubisoft. And I was like, well, it feels like I have a lot of the basis of environment art production, which means when I come to a new studio, I only have to catch up to the game and not also the discipline, which is a nice leg up to have. And it ended up that the team and I were, very compatible. And so I ended up getting that role. And it was, getting to come to work every day and be like, not only am I having a good time, I'm challenged professionally, but I also, like, at the end of the day, I'm like, and I can't wait to play our game. It's just like an extra little bonus that I'm very thankful I get to have. And again, I don't think it's necessary, but it's like, if you can take those opportunities in life, like, let's get those. And it's also kind of, reminded me that while I may have been content staying at Ubisoft, and Ubisoft has a whole myriad of offerings anyways, I also shouldn't limit myself, right? And like, again, let's see if any of these other doors are open, just in case, just to see what's out there. And so, I'm having a wonderful time at Santa Monica Studios, but also what's happening 2, 3, 5 years from now? Am I going to float somewhere else? Am I going to return? For someone who loves planning things, it's actually kind of nice to have that unknown and to be like, and who knows what will happen in the industry, right? Like, I could experience another layoff at this studio, at another studio. And so all I can do is be aware of what I'm interested in and what I think my next challenges are, and then just try and keep gravitating towards those.
Yeah, it's fascinating perspective, like you say, for someone that likes to, know what's coming. To be able to put yourself in a position where you're comfortable with not knowing that, I think that speaks a lot to who you are as well. That's definitely not for everyone. I'm very much of that mind. I'm very much like I'm kind of a wing it and see what happens person, which is why I like to think I work really well with producers, because producers can help organize my chaos mind. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's interesting to be in that position where you And I think maybe layoffs, sort of going back to like, you know, being comfortable with the unknown, right? I think layoffs are a huge part of that, right? I'm guessing, given that you'd sort of been at Ubisoft for, like you said, a while, and that had been your sort of entrance and growth in the industry, having that taken away sort of makes you go, well, I guess, like you said, I guess I better just see what happens and see what comes now, rather than kind of long plan. And
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, the layoff is hard, right? No matter what. And you really have to be careful not to let it feel like a reflection on you or even on the teams or studios that you were working on. Like, so many of these companies operate at the 10, 20, 30, 50,000 person in like employment level. And so it's like, yeah, they shut down our studio, but I can't let that become what Ubisoft was, right? And so I think after a lot of a lot of tears and a lot of talking to people, I did come to the conclusion of like, can't go back to that. They've really made sure of that. That studio is closed, so I can only go forwards, and the only thing I can control is what direction I want to move in, knowing that your path in life is not a straight line and you can never go back to where you are. We're walking on a globe, right? And you might circle back to something and decide you don't want to go back there and you're just going to walk next to it, or you might cut back around. And I think that in its sense is freeing to know, like, I don't know what's going to happen next, but regardless of what happens, I'll have a say in it. Even just how I respond to it. And so in that sense, you are still planning or prepping for it, because you're like, well, I'm going to continue to do work on what my interests are, what my skills are, what my challenges are. And all of that just means that when the unexpected happens, I can give an answer pretty quickly.
yeah, I love that. So you've been in the industry for, you know, seven or so, 8 years. Has it changed you? Has it changed you as a person?
I think the biggest changes I have felt is in my interactions with video games as a whole. I think the most dramatic was truly like figuring out people make video games for a living, to like being a part of that. But I think even going back to like, the media studies that I do, I recently picked up Fire Red and Leaf Green for the Switch, and I was like explaining to my husband the evolution of how experience has worked in Pokemon across the generations, and he's doing his best to follow. He's never played a Pokemon game, and I had a moment where I stopped in that explanation and I was like, this feels silly to say, but I almost feel like I'm doing like a 101 course on experience as a whole, and like being able to call through the different generational changes that have come in Pokemon. And it's like, yes, this is something I'm interested in, I have a passion in, but there is almost an academic language to it that I think sometimes people choose not to, or just don't know to interact with. And I think much like how a lot of film scholars are often talked about being like, well, they're the academics who are, and film is for entertainment. It's nice to know that there are some video game scholars. One of the most impactful audiobooks I heard recently was, oh gosh, I think it's just called The History of Video Games. But it's basically like the first time someone has tried to sit down and be like, where did we start and where are we now? And it's a bunch of case studies, and it's a lot of like, I think there's 2 full chapters about the debate of what the first video game is. And just interacting with the industry in that way is something that I didn't even know existed, and I didn't think I would necessarily be drawn to once I figured it out. But, as of the time of recording this, GDC is next week, and I'm going to be speaking at GDC for the first time ever. This is my 4th year attending. It's always my favorite conference out of all of them, because it's the one where us as game developers get to go, what can I learn from you? What are we really pushing in the boundary? Like, let's just celebrate not necessarily the final product of the games, but like the learning along the way. And that's always been so precious to me, because so much of the industry is like, well, what's the final product? What's the Metacritic score? What's the sales? What's the audience reaction? Which is all important. But I don't think, at least of the developers that I know, no person is singularly motivated by that, right? They all also have a personal connection, a personal curiosity, a desire to, and I think celebrating that part of the games industry is so important. And that's probably, becoming a big advocate of that is probably the biggest way I think I've changed.
I love that. That's yeah, I totally agree. I think the history of the industry, even though it's still relatively young, is deep and fascinating. And yeah, and I think advocating for that is important because, you know, I've done similar things, right? People don't necessarily know where games come from, right? And there's a good opportunity to kind of show them all the joys and the wonders and all the challenges and all the craziness that has got us where we are today. If you weren't making games, Leyla, what would you be doing?
I mean, I feel like that one's easy for me because I do have such a strong passion for acting and filmmaking and so on. I even mentioned, like, I would love to produce long form animation. My dream is to, you know, sort of do acting in the sense that it's also storytelling and bringing, you know, information and experiences to people. So I kind of feel like that one's a cop-out because it's kind of video games light. In a completely different conversational world, I would be a professional horse rider. I did horseback riding for 16 years, and again, very like my train of thought. I was like, this is just a thing people do on weekends. They come here, they ride a horse for 2 hours, they have a really great time, and then nothing else comes out of it. And then my parents were like, do you want to start learning dressage? Do you want to learn to jump so you can compete? And I was like, what? People do careers in horse? No, I'm just here to hang out with a horse and ride a horse for 2 hours and feel cool about that. So I think that would be a really interesting alternate universe for me.
Mm. The professional Olympic horse rider.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, obviously, you know, you got your start really with your dad and your brother, you know, playing video games. How do they relate to your career?
I mean, neither of them are pursuing any sort of video game stuff professionally. I can't describe to you what my dad does. He's an important person at his job and everybody likes working with him. My brother is like a financial analyst for a clean energy startup, but my brother and my dad have really kept in touch through video games, for example. I know a lot of people, you know, It Takes Two was the video game to play with your significant other who had never played video games. But for my dad and my brother, that was how they stayed in touch while my brother was away at college, and they would play online together. And it's funny because my dad introduced all of us to video games, but also video games have evolved so quickly and he's had less and less time to play that, like, now what used to be my dad teaching my brother is now my brother, like, politely being like, no, you have to double jump, Dad. So you have to wait for the first jump to be at its peak to double jump because otherwise you're not going to go far enough. And my dad being like, I used to just push a keyboard button and everything worked. I used to type out my video games or choose your own adventure format. And we're like, okay, well, now you have to double jump across the ledge. So I think in that sense, video gaming has really remained in our lives. And, you know, my dad has a huge interest in technology, like I mentioned, and video games has also helped push him past that. Like, my dad built my first PC for me and taught me how to sort of do all the parts assembly. And now I come home to visit my parents and my dad has built himself like a 3D racing simulation chamber. And like, he literally had to buy this like really in-depth seatbelt because the rig moves so much that he was worried he was gonna get thrown off. And this is just like, this is how my dad's hobby has evolved. And he plays racing sims with the Formula One people. And I got him, since I'm at Sony now, there was a Gran Turismo release. And so I was able to get him a code for that. And he was like, oh, you know, I'm so in on the simulation now. I'm not sure how it'll feel. And he literally just texted me yesterday and he was like, this is one of the best birthday or Christmas presents I've ever had, because it's like, yes, the simulation is cool and so on, but this has reminded me of like the gameplay aspect of video games as well. Like, oh yeah, there are some things in real life that are kind of tedious or maybe difficult. And it's kind of fun to see how a game designer has gone about like fixing that. And that really made me think of Pokopia, which is a game that literally came out yesterday, but I've already played 6 hours of. And just like, you know, Pokemon is a baby's first turn-based RPG, right? And so how do you turn that into an Animal Crossing game? And seeing the way that they've taken something like the amount of PP you have in a move and turned it into your stamina bar for Pokopia. And it's like, wow, we could go into the academics of like genres and how they're so overlapping. And so I think for all of us in the family, it's like we think of so much of our daily lives with that video game lens kind of applied.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and I love the idea of your dad sitting there with his crazy complicated sim racer, and that's really cool. And as we sort of wind this down, one last question, Leyla. When you think of developer Leyla and you think of non-developer Leyla, in your daily life, who's more in charge, right? Who defines you more? Are you defined more by your role, or are you defined more by when you're not working?
That's a good question. I think that this is kind of a cop-out answer, but I think they're so intertwined because I have the privilege of doing something that I have so much interest outside of my professional life. And I think obviously there are some parts of me that I take on or that I only use in my professional life, and I try not to take that home. But I think I am very lucky to be a part of a generation that kind of came into the industry at a time where we were having a lot of conversations around the industry as a whole. And so, I came into the games industry knowing a lot about crunch without ever having even experienced it. And so I knew ahead of time, like, here are the things to look out for. Like, self-crunch is a huge problem. And how can I stop it on myself? And as a producer, how can I try and catch other people who are doing it? And so I think in terms of that, a lot of the things I learned pre-developer Leyla really kind of impact me. But at the same time, I feel very strongly about work-life balance, and I have been very fortunate to work at companies where I feel I can maintain very good work-life balance. And so being able to literally have that moment of like, wow, that was really stressful. There's maybe even an in-progress task happening right now, and yet I'm logging off for the day and I'm going to go play video games for fun now. I know some people have mentioned like it's harder to play games when you work on games all day, and I'm sure being in it, a designer, an artist, that maybe takes even more of a toll on you. But like, there's nothing more exciting to me than like getting out of a playtest for like where we're at in our game and then pulling open my Switch, right? And perhaps something to be said about taking a walk outside every now and then.
Walk while playing the Switch. That's what you do.
And that's the beauty of the Switch. So I do feel very well balanced in that sense. And I think I've also taken some things and learnings from producing and been able to kind of reintroduce them to other Leyla. So
yeah, I absolutely empathize with that answer. It's almost like a trick question, that one, because I think certainly for me they are very blurred. The two versions of me overlap massively. There is virtually no Venn diagram there. So well, yeah, thank you, Leyla. I really appreciate your time. Great to get to know you. Fascinating journey, from traveling around to esports to, finding the role that defines you in video games. I love that. And yeah, great to spend some time with you. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really amazing, and I feel like I want to throw all these questions back at you. So maybe we'll meet again someday, and I can do that.
I love that. I would love to. Sounds good. Thank you.